Radical means to get down to the roots. This is Rootwork, and I'm Thandisizwe Chimurenga. Lynnee Denise, a scholar artist, has written a new biography of the blues artist known as Big Mama Thornton. Through 13 essays and an epilogue, Denise gives us a queer Black biography in essays about the performer who gave us Hound Dog, Ball and Chain before Elvis, Presley, and Janis Joplin, and a few other songs that changed the course of American music. Let's start with the obvious and go from there. Tell our audience why it is that Willie Mae Thornton matters, not Ma Rainey, not Bessie Smith, but Willie Mae.
We cannot have a Willie Mae without Bessie Smith, but I guess what matters about Willie Mae is that she has far less attention, or had far less attention on her life than a Bessie Smith. But when she was touring through the South in the 1940s as a part of a vaudeville, she was referred to as Little Bessie Smith, right? So I think the reason why Willie Mae matters is because it is time for us to understand that she represents one out of many Black women whose stories have been buried in the ashes of, white rock gatekeeping journalists and, record producers who have not seen the value in not only, telling these stories and connecting them to what this country refers to as rock and roll, but understanding a very specific kind of Black Southern working class cultural production that has the value to generate and has generated billions of dollars over the past few centuries since Black folks have been recorded on American soil as musicians.
Why Willie Mae and not Big Mama?
Because she deserves the kind of attention that would allow us to enter her story from the perspective of her interior life world. That I didn't want to start the story with her stage persona, particularly because that stage persona was, or that stage name was given to her by a white man who was the manager of the Apollo Theater at the time in the 1950s when she was there as a part of a residency. And, after he introduced her, he, crowned her in that moment, if you want to use the word crown, Big Mama, right? And what came up for me in that, so-called crowning is my questions about his intention in the use of those two words together, Big Mama, and also the historical difference between what Black folks are talking about when they say Big Mama and what comes to mind in the sort of white collective imagination when they say Big Mama. So I'm not rejecting the name Big Mama, especially because she embraced it herself, but more so I'm just starting the story and maintaining the story using the name her mama gave her. Her full name is Benny Willie Mae Thornton, and she's from Alabama. And that name, that title that comes with a purpose, is one that is rooted in the Southern tradition of naming, right? Willie Mae and, Tammy Jean. And so, right. So like these are Black Southern naming practices that I wanted to honor. And then, we can get to who she was and what she thought of when she used the term Big Mama. But first, Willie Mae Thornton, because she is more than a person who performed for, America.
So when you spoke earlier about Black Southern working class culture, and now you're talking about the naming practices of Black people, you're talking about, quote unquote, the white imagination, the white gaze that even Toni Morrison talks about in terms of what Black people mean when we say Big Mama, and what this manager at the Apollo may have meant when he said Big Mama. So it sounds like what you're doing is an act of reclamation.
Yeah, it's in that family, but it's not one that doesn't give her agency. Because I think that, like, I've noticed that, which I appreciate, people are more conscious about what they call her now, just because I didn't put Big Mama in the title, right? Which is interesting because the book itself would have been more marketable. That's the name that is more recognizable. But I think that reclamation is more so about my personal commitment as a music writer to Black dignity and Black even privacy. You know, like when I think about Willie Mae Thornton and the way that I go through her life and into her story, it is intimate and it is personal and it is righteous in terms of thinking about her beyond the site of injury, which includes, you know, this hound dog moment where she is known almost solely, almost exclusively for being the person that Elvis ripped off, when in reality, she had a 40-year career in music, a 40-year body of work. And she, you know, deserves more. She deserves more.
I'm speaking with Lynnee Denise, scholar, artist, about her new book, Why Willie Mae Thornton Matters. She recently came through the Los Angeles area, stopping at Octavia's Bookshelf in Pasadena, Skylight Books, and at USC's Kaufman School of Dance. I saw your interview with activist and filmmaker Dream Hampton, and if my memory serves me correctly, you all spoke about Willie Mae queering her wardrobe. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know if, you know, as a matter of fact, I know she would not use that word to describe what she was doing, but what she was doing, just by virtue of the definition of, you know, the surface definition of queer, meaning a sort of like, I think, a kind of commitment to you know, normativity, period, whether we're talking about what gets sold to us as normal or what gets sold to us as heteronormative. To be a Black woman and refuse to wear a dress when blues queens are largely associated by their like fancy hats and feathered hats and fancy clothes, I think is revolutionary. I think it is revolutionary that she rejected that gendered way of understanding Black women's contribution to the blues, and decided instead that, like, for her, you know, pants made more sense. A plaid shirt made more sense. At later stages of her life, a three-piece, you know, double-breasted suit made more sense. A Texas brim made more sense. Texas cowboy boots made more sense. Overalls made more sense for her for several reasons. You know, she carried her tools. She carried a harmonica. She was someone who had to fend for herself and defend herself, and oftentimes fight promoters physically if necessary, if they tried to, you know, cheat her out of money. So I think that the clothes just represents one aspect of her, you know, well, I guess what Sadia Hartman would call politics of refusal. So yeah, her queering the blues image isn't a reference to her sexuality, but more her political stance. And that political stance is truly about her commitment to her authentic self.
I interviewed Paula Giddings years ago, and she said that when she was writing her book, When and Where I Enter: The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America, Ida B. Wells walked into the first chapter of that book and refused to leave until Giddings promised her her own book. Did you and
Mhm.
Willie Mae have a conversation about this book?
I really love that question, especially because I know how much you love Ida B. Wells and how much she informs your work. I love that you brought her here with us to sit with us. Um, I had this idea in the beginning stages of the book where I would stage, if you will, an interview between Willie Mae and I, right? I guess a speculative one, a fictional one, because I think that I assume that by the end of the book, I would know who she is and how she would answer certain questions. And I do feel that way about certain questions she would answer. But I think what remains true for me is that I've received several messages that tell me and tell my spirit that she would approve with how I've handled her legacy. You know, like, but I do get this feeling that this desire to claim her as gay or lesbian is something that is quite annoying to her, right? So, like, I think that she would be proud of me for continuing to defend the fact that, or not defend, but to make clear that she never claimed any kind of sexuality. That does not make her straight by default or queer. And so I think that she would appreciate how I've handled that particular juggling of her legacy. So I think that overall she would be okay with how I've written this book about her. And I'd be curious in that interview to ask her how she feels about where our stories intersect. Because in the book, some of what I talk about is those politics of refusal that I felt as a young woman growing up in LA and hating when my mama would go school shopping with me and buy me dresses, and I would go to school with a backpack full of clothes that I really needed and wanted to wear, clothes that would allow me to break dance, clothes that will allow me to backflip, right? And then I would change back into those clothes and go home. Willie Mae did a similar thing on stage. Her management team would buy her dresses, and she would sometimes come out with her own clothes and surprise them and still blow the house down and make it clear that the audience preferred her authenticity.
It's interesting you bring that up because that is my next question. I wanted to know more about your connections, you and Willie Mae's connections to Los Angeles.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm, born and raised in LA, Baldwin Hills Elementary, Audubon Junior High School, Dorsey High School, grew up cruising Crenshaw on Sundays, got family in the Pacoima Valley, grew up listening to 1580 K-Day, went to Slauson Swap Meet and to Compton Swap Meet on a regular basis. I am Black Los Angeles, right? And I was born in 1975, and it was around that time that Willie Mae was living in the Bay Area. And she is, as I said, originally from Alabama, and then she made this important sort of, traceable migration from Alabama, first of all, from Ayrton, Alabama, which is where she's from, to Montgomery, Alabama, and from there throughout the South, but mainly based in Atlanta. And then she left Atlanta and moved right here in Houston, Texas, which is where I happen to be in the moment. And from Houston, Texas, she moved to the Bay. And then from the Bay, she moved to LA. So, she was back and forth in, between the Bay and LA, like most musicians performing at different live venues. But then she decided to settle here in the late 70s. And yeah, I mean, her settling here is a gift to me in terms of the fact that, and I mentioned this, in my work, that like, I took my first breath where she took her last. I was born in 75. She took her last breath in 1984 when I was 9. And I am currently working on getting her a headstone because her body lays in Inglewood Cemetery and in a pauper's grave. And so I know that with this book comes a kind of cultural capital and leverage and even some resources. And so it would be a crime for me to not just simply give back, but stay in the communication, stay in conversation with Willie Mae by continuing to honor her, by having her, pauper's grave replaced with a headstone because it's a basic dignity question. And then because I am from LA, I feel like I have a responsibility to see that through.
Well, please keep us abreast of the work to get that done, to get that headstone done. So, lastly, I wanted to ask you about DJ scholarship and how this book came about. I know you primarily as a DJ, someone who quote unquote spins the records, and you do that in a way in which I've called conjuring, but we'll get into that later. But I do also know that you are a scholar and you have written before essays. Now you've written your first book. Tell our audience, what is DJ scholarship?
DJ scholarship is a framework that well, first of all, it's a phrase that I coined in 2013, and it's a phrase that names a framework or maybe a method of sort of investigating the world around Black music using the cultural practices that I associate with DJing, which includes things like, first of all, deep listening, chasing samples, digging through different crates, through different genres of music, through different eras, through different regions where Black music is born, it's about, studying album cover arts to learn an alternative visual history of Blackness and how it's represented through music. It's about studying, reading, learning from, thinking with liner notes, and following in Amiri Baraka's tradition of writing about Black music, as a Black artist with an intentional focus on the social and cultural context under which that music emerges and forms. So, that combination of listening, of digging, of, studying album cover art, of reading liner notes critically, combined, allowed me to, write essays and or host radio shows where I have different themes and I talk about different musical regional styles, and yes, eventually a book about a blues musician who had so little written about her that I felt like I trusted DJ scholarship as a framework to be able to get through an entire story if I use some of those same principles that we as DJs use to present music at a party, which is really rooted in research. That's what DJing, that's what happens before we show up at a party, is like we have listened, there's research involved, depending on what kind of DJ you are, obviously. I'm maybe from an older school of DJs who spent hours and hours listening, seeking out music, reading liner notes, and figuring out who different musicians are, and then tracing that story, and then landing in a new genre of music. And that, right. So, like, using those skills helped me to produce this book.
I wonder how many people nowadays actually pay attention to liner notes. I
I,
wonder.
I don't think very many. I think it's a lost art. I think it's a lost kind of genre of literature. And I think that it is a part of this larger music industrial complex's desire to capitalize on the quick and the familiar. And in that capitalization of that, we lose a very intimate connection that we had with a kind of multi-sensory level of engagement with albums, that we used to pick these albums up, turn them around, open them. Some of us wrote our names in these albums. Some of us used alcohol to clean a scratch, so we thought we were doing. Some of us put pennies on, the needle head, and we're just like learning about ourselves through what is written about an album. And so I miss those times, and my work highlights those times.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a story I'll tell you one day about Voodoo and Marie Laveau and how it was all crystallized through liner notes. I was like, okay, wow, right. But anyway,
Who?
look,
Just tell me whose liner notes, though.
Joe Sample.
Oh my! That's a wonderful story.
Joe, it was okay. Well, since we're here, it's a song called X Marks the Spot. I would
Hmm.
hear it on commercial radio, smooth jazz radio, and
Hmm.
something about it just grabbed me. And after I don't know how many hours of hearing it on the radio, I heard a DJ talking about the liner notes one night. And based on the liner notes, he was talking about the fact that Joe Sample out of East Texas was originally from New Orleans and
Hmm.
had been either raised or cared for by black nuns, one of whom was related to Marie Laveau. And then he started talking about her history and about voodoo and how his song X Marks the Spot was a reference to when you go to Marie Laveau's grave, you put an X on it and request her to do something for you, and she'll grant your request. And I was like, oh my God. And all of that was right there in a liner note.
That's perfect. That's a perfect example. That's a perfect example of the usefulness, and even some of the culturally coded and sometimes maybe secrets that we can hold through liner notes. That's great. Thank you for that.
And I had to go out and buy the CD just for the liner note. I had to go
That's
buy it.
that's listen, that's
Mhm.
literally exciting to me. That is at the core of my work right there. The digging, even if it's just like, oh, let me go and find this. That is what I mean by digging. It's the effort.
Mhm.
It's the
And
effort.
I still remember after all of these years how beautiful and mystical the album cover for Earth, Wind, and Fire is all in all. I was like, wow, that should be a painting. Of
You
course, back
see,
then I was like poster. I want that as a poster for my wall. That should be a painting.
you went right there because those are the people who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Earth, Wind, and Fire's album covers. I'm talking about Parliament Funkadelic album covers. I am talking about the Ohio Players album covers. I am talking about Prince's album covers, and even the basic ones that don't seem as intricate as like an Earth, Wind, and Fire or a Parliament, but like something as simple as like Michael Jackson Thriller and him laying in this white suit, and you open it up and he's there with a tiger, and right, but it's like that was intentional. That album cover stays with us. That album cover will stay with us. So I appreciate you bringing Earth, Wind, and Fire to the mix to think about maybe what their music looks like, because with Earth, Wind, and Fire and Parliament, the music happened to look like the art that represented it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to keep you. I know your time is precious, but I have to ask you. This is a personal question. I
Mm-hmm.
know people who love music, love all kinds of music. I can't say I'm that kind of person, but understanding you and how rooted you are in Black culture, in funk, in the Southern Black blues tradition, you also like Bjork. I'm like, well, how does that fit in?
Yeah, because Bjork is a student of us as well, like she's a student of music. She's a super just gifted creature. And she moves me maybe from a similar place that Sade does. Maybe she's on the other side of the coin of a Sade, right? You imagine Sade as being like this quiet, soulful, sultry voice from the UK. But at the end of the day, it is actually more of a quiet fire. And there is sometimes, a hint of rage in how she loves. And I think that someone like Bjork can't contain the rage, but it is no more or maybe no less impactful. So like what I love about Bjork is, she's this Icelandic person whose ancestors are Vikings, and she is like, coming out of punk culture in Iceland and also has a kind of politics of refusal. But then she goes to London and hooks up with these Black producers. So a lot of times when I find, white music that I'm drawn to, usually Black folks are hovering around the creation of it, the influence on it. And so that can be said about Bjork too. But as a standalone artist, she's outstanding to me, and a full package in terms of fashion. She's an actress, she's a lyricist, she's a musician, she's a producer, and she is another person who is like a master of privacy while being hyper, you know, visible and accessible to her fans. She also maintains a kind of privacy that I admire and that I wish that people like Whitney Houston had and was able to do.
Speaking with DJ Lynnee Denise, scholar, artist DJ Lynnee Denise, author of the new book, Why Willie Mae Thornton Matters, recently came through Los Angeles. Unfortunately, missed those readings that you did live at Octavia's Bookshelf and at Skylight Books, but folks can still get those books that you signed, if there are any left, they can still pick up the book. DJ Lynnee Denise, thank you so much for your time, for your example. Thank you for being on Rootwork today.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your examples and your personal stories. It helped. I love it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.